In the quiet neighborhoods of Milwaukee, behind thin apartment walls and locked doors, something unimaginable was happening. It wasn't a ghost story or a tale of urban legend. It was real. Between 1978 and 1991, one man committed acts so horrific that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend them. This is not fiction. This is the true disturbing story of Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Monster. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. From the outside, his childhood appeared ordinary. A quiet boy living in the American Midwest during a time of post-war optimism. But beneath the surface, there were fractures forming that no one seemed to see. His father, a chemist, was often away for work, while his mother struggled with depression and bouts of hysteria. The home, filled with arguments and tension, became a place of emotional isolation for young Jeffrey. Those who knew him as a child recalled his vacant stare and his strange calmness, a stillness that seemed almost unnatural for someone so young. By the time Dahmer reached his early teens in Bath, Ohio, his behavior began to shift from quiet to quietly disturbing. He developed an unsettling fascination with the lifeless. He would collect roadkill, dissecting the bodies of small animals, storing their bones in jars, and studying them as if searching for something hidden in death itself. His father, mistaking this for scientific curiosity, even showed him how to properly bleach and preserve animal bones, a lesson that would later become grotesquely significant. Neighbors would see him wandering near wooded areas, dragging roadkill into the backyard, while his classmates whispered about the boy who seemed oddly amused by decay. Inside his mind, curiosity began to twist into obsession. Dahmer later confessed that as early as age 14, he began fantasizing about control, about holding someone so completely they could never leave him. He longed for companionship, but his loneliness was accompanied by desires that he couldn't explain. His inner world grew darker, and while most teenagers were discovering friendships or first loves, Jeffrey was discovering the stillness of death. Alcohol became his escape. By high school, he was frequently drunk, showing up to class inebriated, often joking or performing bizarre antics to gain attention. Teachers and classmates laughed it off, unaware of the turmoil festering behind his distant eyes. When his parents' marriage finally disintegrated in 1978, Jeffrey was left alone in the family house for the first time. His mother had left with his younger brother, and his father had moved out temporarily. The silence of that empty home would mark the turning point. Dahmer, now 18, spent his nights drinking heavily, wandering roads, and sinking into fantasies that blurred the line between life and death. In that summer's loneliness, his curiosity would soon meet its first victim. It was the summer of 1978, in the quiet suburb of Bath, Ohio. Jeffrey Dahmer had just graduated high school, a young man adrift and drinking heavily, his days spent in isolation inside the empty family home. The arguments that had once filled the air were gone. His mother and brother had left for Wisconsin, and his father was away. Alone in that silence, Dahmer's thoughts began to spiral deeper into darkness. His fantasies of control and possession had been growing stronger, and he found himself imagining what it might feel like to keep someone with him, someone who could never leave. That July, the fantasy crossed the line into reality. On a warm afternoon, Dahmer was driving aimlessly down a rural road when he spotted 19-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks. The young man was walking with a guitar slung over his shoulder, heading to a rock concert in Lockwood Corners. Dahmer slowed his car, offered him a ride, and invited him back to his house to drink a few beers before continuing the journey. Hicks agreed, unaware that he had just stepped into the orbit of a predator. For hours, they talked and drank in Dahmer's living room, music playing faintly in the background. But as the afternoon faded into dusk, Hicks mentioned he should get going, and something inside Dahmer snapped. The thought of being left alone again filled him with dread, a consuming fear of abandonment that had followed him for years. When Hicks stood up to leave, Dahmer panicked. Grabbing a dumbbell from the floor, he struck him from behind. The sound echoed through the empty house, followed by a silence that seemed eternal. Hicks fell to the floor, bleeding, gasping for air. In a daze, Dahmer straddled him and pressed the handle of the dumbbell against his throat until the movement stopped. The act had been impulsive yet deliberate, a moment that gave him the illusion of control he had long craved. Afterward, Dahmer sat beside the body for hours, drinking and staring, trying to comprehend what he had done. But the stillness no longer frightened him. It fascinated him. As morning light crept through the windows, reality returned. Dahmer needed to hide what had happened. Using the same skills his father had taught him, he methodically dissected the body, separating flesh from bone. He buried the remains in a shallow grave behind the house, but later, overcome by curiosity, he unearthed them. He stripped the flesh using acid and scattered the bones in the woods, crushing them with a sledgehammer until they were unrecognizable. The entire process was done with a chilling calmness, as though he were performing an experiment rather than concealing a murder. For Dahmer, this was not merely about killing. It was about the preservation of something that belonged entirely to him. No one suspected a thing. Hicks was reported missing, but the case quickly went cold. Dahmer's father soon returned home, unaware that a human life had been taken just yards from where he stood. Jeffrey's demeanor appeared unchanged, quiet, polite, and withdrawn. Beneath that calm exterior, however, the seed of a monster had been planted. The first act of violence had awakened something within him that would never again be silenced. After nearly a decade of silence, Jeffrey Dahmer resurfaced in Milwaukee in 1987, living a quiet and unassuming life that hid a dark obsession growing stronger each year. He had been arrested a few times for disorderly conduct and sexual assault, but the system had released him back into society, labeling him troubled yet harmless. Behind his calm demeanor, his thoughts were consumed by fantasies of total control, of owning another person completely. It was in a small one-bedroom apartment on North 25th Street, apartment 213, where these fantasies would be unleashed, in a manner so horrific that investigators later described it as stepping into a nightmare made real. In September 1987, Dahmer met his next victim, Stephen Tuomi, at a hotel in downtown Milwaukee. The two shared drinks, and Dahmer claimed to have blacked out. When he awoke the next morning, Tuomi lay lifeless beside him, his chest caved in, and Dahmer's hands bruised. Something inside him had shifted once more. Instead of panicking, he purchased a large suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's basement where he lived at the time, and began a gruesome ritual of dismemberment. He preserved parts of Tuomi's remains, photographing the process with a Polaroid camera to capture every stage. For Dahmer, the photographs were more than trophies. They were proof that the person could never leave him, that he could hold on to the moment forever. After being forced to move out of his grandmother's home in 1988 due to strange odors and late-night noises, Dahmer rented the infamous apartment on North 25th Street. The building was old, its walls thin, and the smell of decay frequently masked by cooking aromas and cleaning chemicals. His neighbors, mostly unaware of what lay inside, occasionally complained of foul odors seeping from his unit. Dahmer would smile politely and blame spoiled meat or malfunctioning refrigerators, even offering food to those who asked questions. Behind the locked door, the apartment had become a workshop of death. The refrigerator held human remains. The closet contained skulls carefully cleaned and bleached. The bathroom housed acid and chemicals used to dissolve flesh. Each murder became part of a ritual, luring young men with promises of money or companionship, drugging them, and then killing them once they were unconscious. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer murdered at least 16 young men, many of them from marginalized communities. He kept detailed records, names, and photographs as though cataloging his victims. Some he posed in specific positions after death, attempting to recreate the companionship he longed for but could never achieve in life. He experimented with preservation, boiling flesh, bleaching bones, and even attempting crude forms of taxidermy. At one point, he drilled holes into the skulls of victims, injecting acid in an attempt to create a living zombie, a person completely under his control. His acts blurred the line between death and science, his need for domination transforming into something grotesque and mechanical. The sounds that came from apartment 213 were sometimes masked by music or the hum of a fan. Neighbors like Pamela Bass remembered him as quiet, polite, even shy, never suspecting the horrors unfolding next door. The smell, however, lingered, a sweet, foul odor that no air freshener could hide for long. Dahmer's isolation deepened, and his actions became more reckless, his collection of bones and body parts growing into a morbid shrine. He imagined creating a complete skeleton, even a throne made of human skulls. For him, these remains were not just trophies, but symbols of belonging, pieces of people who could never abandon him again. The apartment, with its dull yellow walls and flickering lights, became a tomb for his victims. Photographs later recovered by investigators showed dozens of images, each more disturbing than the last. Bodies arranged, limbs separated, heads preserved in jars. The Polaroids told the story Dahmer could never speak aloud. Each image was a confession, a frozen moment of his control over another human being. As the years passed, his need for secrecy clashed with his growing compulsion, and the apartment became unbearable, a place filled with ghosts of the men he refused to let go. Yet to the outside world, he remained unremarkable, a quiet man with soft eyes and a calm voice, whose true self lived only behind the locked door of apartment 213. On the night of July 22, 1991, Milwaukee police officers responded to what they believed would be a routine call, a disturbance complaint from a man claiming he had narrowly escaped being handcuffed by another. The man was 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, terrified and trembling as he led officers to the Oxford apartments at 924 North 25th Street. He spoke rapidly, his eyes wide with fear, describing how the man he had met earlier that evening had tried to keep him captive, whispering strange things about wanting to take pictures and control him. The officers followed Edwards up to apartment 213, unaware that they were about to step into one of the most horrifying crime scenes in modern American history. When Dahmer opened the door, he appeared calm, polite, even friendly. He told the officers it was all a misunderstanding, that they could come in if they wished. The small apartment looked ordinary at first glance. A fish tank glowing in the dim light, a faint hum of a refrigerator in the corner. But then Officer Rolf Mueller noticed a strange chemical smell, sharp and metallic. Edwards pointed to the bedroom, whispering that that's where the knife had been. As Mueller stepped closer, something on the bedside table caught his attention, a stack of Polaroid photographs, dozens of them, each showing what appeared to be human bodies in various states of dismemberment. When he looked closer, his blood ran cold. These were not artistic photos. They were documentation, evidence of unspeakable acts. The officers turned to Dahmer, who suddenly realized the secret he had guarded for years was no longer hidden. When Muller shouted for him to put his hands behind his back, Dahmer resisted briefly, but the officers subdued him. The photographs fell to the floor, scattering across the carpet like snapshots of hell. As backup arrived, the search began, and what they found would haunt them forever. Inside the refrigerator was a freshly severed human head, its expression eerily calm. In the freezer, 3 more heads were stored, along with neatly wrapped packages of human flesh. The freezer's cold air mixed with the stench of decay that permeated the small apartment. In a filing cabinet drawer, officers discovered human skulls, some painted, others bleached white. On the closet shelf were jars containing preserved organs, hearts, livers, and genitals suspended in formaldehyde. A large blue barrel filled with acid sat in the corner of the bedroom, inside which 3 torsos were dissolving. In total, investigators would recover the remains of 11 different men from the apartment. Each piece told a story of violence, obsession, and ritual. It was as if Dahmer had constructed a shrine to his own madness, a physical manifestation of the control he had always craved. The apartment, once silent and still, was now a swarm of movement. Officers, photographers, detectives, all trying to make sense of the horror surrounding them. As the night turned into morning, the full scale of Dahmer's crimes began to emerge. He confessed calmly, almost clinically, as if discussing an experiment. He told detectives about his methods, how he lured men from bars, offered them money to pose for photos, drugged them, and then killed them while they slept. He described how he tried to keep parts of them, not out of hatred, but out of fear of abandonment. His voice remained steady as he recounted boiling flesh, bleaching skulls, and photographing bodies in specific poses to relive the moment later. To the investigators listening, it felt less like a confession and more like an anatomy lecture from a man who had lost touch with humanity long. He got neighbors who had once seen Dahmer as a quiet tenant, stood in disbelief as police carried out boxes of evidence. They remembered the foul odors, the sounds at night, the excuses about spoiled meat or exotic fish. Now they realized they had been living beside a slaughterhouse hidden in plain sight. The city of Milwaukee woke up to the headlines the next morning, struggling to comprehend the scale of the horror. Families of missing men gathered in fear, hoping their loved ones were not among the dead, but dreading the confirmation that many would soon receive. Inside the police station, Dahmer's calmness unnerved even seasoned detectives. He expressed remorse, yet there was a detachment in his words, as though he was observing his own life from a distance. He spoke of loneliness, of a desperate need to possess someone so completely that they could never leave him. He described failed experiments, injecting acid into the brains of living victims in an attempt to create obedient companions. The words were delivered with no emotion, no tremor of fear or guilt. It was as if he were simply recounting the steps of a process he had perfected over years of isolation and delusion. By dawn, apartment 213 was sealed off, transformed into a crime scene that would haunt investigators for the rest of their lives. The smell lingered in their clothes, the images burned into their minds. What they had uncovered that night was not just the evidence of murder, it was the revelation of a hidden world, a window into the mind of a man whose desire for control had consumed everything human within him. The nightmare had finally ended for the city, but for those who had seen inside Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, the darkness would never truly fade. In the weeks that followed Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest, Milwaukee became a city gripped by disbelief and horror. The details that emerged from police reports and court documents painted a picture so grotesque that even veteran detectives struggled to process it. The calm, soft-spoken man who had lived quietly among them had been hiding a world of unimaginable depravity. As investigators sifted through evidence, the stories of the victims began to surface. Young men with dreams, families and futures, each lured into the same apartment from which none ever returned. The public's reaction was a mixture of grief, rage and bewilderment. People questioned how someone could commit such acts for years without being stopped. Journalists filled the streets outside the courthouse, and every new detail seemed to deepen the city's collective nightmare. Dahmer's trial began in January 1992, under the watchful eyes of a world desperate for answers. He was charged with 17 counts of murder, though only 16 would stand in Wisconsin, as his first crime in Ohio was prosecuted separately. The courtroom was tense, filled with victims' families, reporters and psychologists trying to comprehend what drove this man to kill. Dahmer sat motionless, dressed neatly, his demeanor eerily polite. When asked to plead, he surprised many by saying he was guilty but insane. The defense argued that he suffered from a deep psychological disorder, an uncontrollable compulsion rooted in loneliness and delusion. The prosecution countered that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, that he had planned his crimes meticulously, concealing evidence and manipulating victims. Each argument brought the jurors deeper into the darkness of his mind. Throughout the trial, the public heard his confessions in chilling detail. He described how he had tried to make living zombies, how he photographed victims to remember them, and how he consumed parts of their bodies as a way to make them part of him forever. Forensic experts confirmed the horrors. Tools, skulls, and human remains found in his apartment matched his descriptions precisely. Each revelation drew gasps from the courtroom, and many family members broke down in tears as they listened to his cold explanations. Yet Dahmer himself rarely showed emotion. His tone was calm, detached, almost academic. He seemed to understand the gravity of his actions, but spoke as if describing someone else's life, not his own. On February 15th, 1992, the verdict was read. The jury rejected the insanity plea and found Jeffrey Dahmer legally sane and guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms, 957 years in prison, ensuring that he would never again walk free. As he was led away, relatives of his victims shouted at him, calling him a monster, a demon, a curse upon humanity. But Dahmer did not respond. He lowered his head slightly, eyes vacant, as though already resigned to the punishment he knew he deserved. The trial had ended, but the shadow it cast would linger for decades. Prison life for Dahmer was paradoxically quiet. At Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, he was kept separate from other inmates for months due to threats on his life. In interviews, he expressed regret, even a kind of spiritual awakening, claiming to have found religion and seeking forgiveness. He read the Bible, met with the prison minister, and occasionally spoke to reporters in a tone of subdued reflection. Some saw it as a sign of genuine repentance. Others believed it was just another mask, another layer of manipulation. Inmates who crossed paths with him described him as polite but unsettling, a man whose calmness felt unnatural as time went on. Dahmer was allowed to work alongside other prisoners in the prison's janitorial detail. On the morning of November 28, 1994, He was assigned to clean the gym area with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. For reasons that remain debated, the guards left them unsupervised. 20 minutes later, Dahmer was found lying face down on the floor, his head bludgeoned with a metal bar. Anderson was also attacked, and both men died from their injuries. Scarver later claimed that God had told him to carry out justice for Dahmer's crimes. The news spread quickly, and many of the victims' families felt a grim sense of closure, believing that justice had come not from the law, but from fate itself. Jeffrey Dahmer's death marked the end of one of the most disturbing chapters in American criminal history. Yet his name continued to haunt public consciousness, appearing in documentaries, films, and books that tried to dissect the psychology of evil. The apartment complex where he committed his crimes was demolished in 1992, its lot left vacant, as if no structure should ever again occupy that cursed ground. Milwaukee moved on, but the memories of what happened inside apartment 213 never faded. It became a cautionary tale about the darkness that can hide in plain sight, a reminder that true horror does not always lurk in shadows. It can live next door, behind a smile, waiting in silence.